Good day, everyone. I'm Michael McNutt, Director of Education and Events for WEDI. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the next phase of data innovation, NEHEN 3.0. To start us off, please welcome Denny Brennan, Executive Director and CEO of the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank WEDI for hosting this event and for the honor of being able to present the work that we're doing at MHDC through our NEHEN 3.0 effort to your membership. If you have questions during the course of the presentation, please pop them in chat as we speak. There will be time at the end of the presentation for Q&A, and if we can get to your questions beforehand, we will do that. So let's move forward. All right, just briefly about the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium. We have been a convener of the health data community in Massachusetts for 45 years, since 1978, going on 46 years. We convene the health data community, payers, providers, physicians, government agencies, technology companies, other not-for-profits, associations, the whole community, to look at how health data and information can advance quality, access, affordability, and equity. The other thing that's important for us as a consortium is that we are actively involved through the Data Governance Collaborative that we host with Janice Karen, leading that effort to keep our members and our community apprised of federal and state health data regulations. We believe strongly in modernizing health data and exchange, not only because it's better technically or more comprehensive, but because it's leading us to a market where individuals have much more power over their healthcare decisions, over how they want to manage their care, and with whom they want to share that experience and with whom they don't. So the idea of a patient-centered health data economy is central to our vision as a company, and our mission is to use the latest in technologies, the latest in collaborative efforts. We believe that technology is necessary but insufficient to achieving real change. So we really look to convene the community, build relationships, advance technology to meet these kinds of goals. Lastly, while we're a locally focused Massachusetts not-for-profit, we have more of a federal, or I should say national footprint. We have been actively involved in WEDI for a number of years, and we are frequently contributing in conversations held across the country on matters of health data exchange, interoperability, and some of the more modern use cases associated with that. So why don't we move to the next page? I am very happy and privileged to introduce my colleagues, Dave Delano and Janice Karen. Dave, why don't you and then Janice take a moment to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, hey, sure thing, Denny. Hi, this is Dave Delano. I'm the Senior Director of Services for Mass Health Data Consortium and have been the Executive Director for NEHEN for about 10 years now. Time flies when you're having fun. I also sit on the WEDI, I'm a co-chair of the WEDI Prior Authorization Subwork Group.
Janice?
Hi, I'm Janice Karen. I'm our Director of Policy, Technology, and Innovation. And as Denny mentioned, I run our Data Governance Collaborative, where we bring the community together to discuss data standards, interoperability, and regulations. And I also have the privilege of writing most of the regulatory comments that we write. And I just want to, I'm also the new co-chair of the WEDI Health Equity Work Group. And I just want to point out to people that this is your opportunity to be the one asking me the questions. So take advantage of that.
Thank you, Janice. Dave, next page. Why don't I turn it over to you, Dave, at this point, and why don't you take us through NEHEN 3.0?
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that quickly, Denny. I've got a lot to cover today. So welcome, everybody. I think most people, if you haven't heard of NEHEN, the New England Healthcare Exchange Network, we are a consortium of trading partners, mostly administrative trading partners, payers, and providers doing an exchange service that we've been running, as I mentioned, with myself for about 10 years. We're in version 2.0 right now. We're moving to a new version we're calling it NEHEN 3.0. And for those that haven't heard the story about it, what we're all about here, as Denny mentioned, is a collaborative community of exchange or trading partners working together to develop, open standards-based exchange services. For today, primarily, it's really exclusively administrative data exchange using X12 transactions, but we're in this 3.0 version, we're envisioning a conjoined or merged administrative and clinical data exchange set of services through NEHEN 3.0. We call this the convergence of administrative and clinical data. We've been talking about that for some time within NEHEN, MHDC, and even at WEDI. So this is this is our version of bringing that to the real world. We're going to begin with some priority use cases. I mentioned prior authorization already, and Janice will probably speak quite a bit about quality measures. We are envisioning the improvement of those exchange capabilities between payers and providers, primarily use those use cases, to continue to advance the efficiencies in healthcare, as Denny mentioned, really driving forward with healthcare improvement using an exchange set of services through NEHEN 3.0. We are going to follow that up with more functionality as time goes on, but our initial use cases are really focused on the EPA prior authorization workflow, as has been recently. I think people are aware of the federal rule that just came out last week, and the Da Vinci implementation guides standards that are defining that for us going forward. So we're focusing on those. And the idea is that we meet people where they currently are while providing a pathway to the future. So we're going to certainly bridge over from existing capabilities in the marketplace today, and then set that up as a way to move forward with the more advanced API. Let's call them advanced clinical data exchange services as we go forward. So that's our plan. This is a just quick diagram that describes sort of the vision of what sort of lives within this NEHEN 3.0 rubric, if you will. It's a combination of things, automation services, as we mentioned. We're currently in an RFP process. We'll speak a little bit about that later, but we're currently in an RFP process to select several vendors to support these automation services that we envision as part of the central or the core of NEHEN 3.0. Wrapped around that is, as Janice mentioned already, the Data Governance Collaborative, or governance and data governance. We were talking about quality measures this morning on that meeting, and there's a lot to talk about around data governance as we go forward with exchange of these more advanced use cases. So we're going to continue to have that as a sort of a fabric, if you will, that wraps around the automation services at the center. Connectivity, that's just a given. Obviously, we need to continue to advance interoperability and exchange and connectivity services, and figuring out what those priority use cases are through data governance going forward so that we can continue to advance. And we see this as an iterative advancing process that over time will continue to adopt and bring more use cases into the NEHEN 3.0 set of services over time. And that will be dependent upon priorities defined by our community. And so that, reaches, it speaks to our community based services that Denny was describing in our collaboration there. Infrastructure support obviously is a part of that, doing things that are core to the central exchange capabilities like endpoint routing, endpoint services for identifying where transactions need to go and who those transactions need to be exchanged with, the security of those transactions, really setting up centralized onboarding and support services associated with that. You can almost think of it a little bit like a brokered transaction through these services. We're not necessarily interested in centralized repository models without getting too far into an architectural discussion, but we really see this as an end-to-end set of exchange services and not a centralized repository model of data that we would manage. So there'll be other things in the center there too, like code mapping and translation for clinical standard codes to be mapped across different code sets. And then also things like translational services where we would translate, for example, to and from X12 if needed, things of that nature. So that's the central part of the support services. And then really, we've mentioned standards already, but certainly being standards compliant and validating transactions to the standards is a part of what those central services will be. So that's it in the circular diagram. Next slide.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead, Janice.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the features. Dave already mentioned some of this, but our current NEHEN offering is primarily X12 EDI services, and one of the goals of this project is to update our existing services in those areas and to make sure that we're offering the best possible overall value to people who are already using them or new folks who might want to start using them. But it's also very important to us that we incorporate fire support and related infrastructure components, and that we make that a cohesive system where it's NEHEN 3.0, not here's NEHEN 3.0 for X12 off in a corner, and over here's where you have some fire stuff, and over in that area we're doing prior auth, but that we have a NEHEN service that shares support structure, infrastructure, interfaces, etc. And then, as already mentioned, we're looking to automate key fire-based exchange use cases. We are starting with prior authorization and quality measures built on top of that core infrastructure. Another area that hasn't come up yet, but that we're looking to support is having some NEHEN operated services for each use case, in case people don't want to do the entire processing on the back end. While our main thrust of support is end-to-end between payers and providers, we may stand up, for instance, a CRD service for those payers who wish to have us manage their CRD. For those of you who don't know what CRD is, that's a portion of the prior auth process, coverage requirements and discovery that let you know if you need to get a prior auth for a service. And then the last part, which has already come up several times, is this idea of a collaborative governance process that determines how we move forward in an iterative fashion, which use cases are next, what we add to the existing use cases. Do we do price transparency next? Do we look at some of the CMS APIs? That's all going to be handled on sort of a community basis where we have a process that will look at what people are using, what they're asking for, what the current regulatory environment is, and makes decisions based on that entire environment. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So some of the areas where we see NEHEN 3.0 adding value is obviously in reducing administrative burden. Automating prior auth reduces that, but also the idea of having a single infrastructure for all of your exchange needs, whether that's using X12 or Fire, and not having to think about where do I have to go today, what am I doing, how do I connect to it, etc. And being incredibly standards-based when we can be, and trying to really go to the standard and pushing standards when they don't meet our needs, and if needed, defining our own standards until the industry catches up. Again, having that single point of access for all trading partners, so you don't have to worry about who you want to exchange with today. And, again, reducing that redundant investment, having the one place to go, having it all built once, and not having everyone have to stand up their own services to do that. It's all handled through NEHEN. Agile adoption of new technology, workflows, and processes, and making sure that we are being responsive to the community. If a new regulation comes out that has a short time frame that's within the purview of what we're supporting, perhaps changing our priorities to make sure that we handle that in a timely fashion, and being designed from the start so that we can do that and not have it be a major problem. Already have all those processes in place so that we can move quickly and change quickly and react to the environment, because let's face it, there's what I like to call the tsunami of regulations. I know that WEDI uses the term rating regulations, and things are changing at a really rapid pace, and there's an expectation that you're going to build on what you've already built. And so we're designing NEHEN to do that from the start. And, and again, ensuring that we do comply with those rules, and that our customers and our clients and our community are on top of what they need to do and doing it the right way, in a standards-based way, and also doing that in an effective, cost-effective way, efficient way, because it's all being handled through by a trusted nonprofit. And I believe at this point, I am passing it back to Dave. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm doing one more slide. My apologies. So how are we doing this? Again, it's all collaborative. We're trying to be evolving and adaptive, and we're looking at the feature development, having iterative processes. We're not using a 3-year design phase and then we're stuck with that for 5 years. Our entire system is built to be reactive and to meet the needs of what everyone has, and trying to serve the end user, making sure that we do what they need us to do, that we're responsive to them, and that we're transparent, and that everyone knows what we're doing as much as possible. We also want to make sure that we're not forcing people to use stuff that they're not ready. Again, that meet people where they are and lead them towards where they need to be in the future. So we let our people can pick. They can start just with X12 services and slowly work their way into FHIR as they're ready. Or they could just use prior auth and move to quality measures later, or vice versa. And whenever possible, making things standard-based, but leveraging the DGC and the work that we've done looking at data centers and understanding data and explaining how APIs work and all of that stuff to come up with innovative solutions if the industry isn't quite there to solve something that we need solved. And now I'm passing back to Dave.
Unmute my phone here. Right, so that's great, Janice, thank you. And obviously, if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to post those. I think we're doing it in the chat, but we're happy to address those as well. So the notion around this really, it came out of two things. Obviously, it came out of the current NEHEN environment. As I mentioned before, we have trading partners within the greater New England area that are exchanging a fairly high volume of administrative transactions today. And we do that through, we describe it as a hub and spoke model of exchange services that we have today. It's really true in that if you look at sort of the world of what we do today and how complicated it would be without these sort of consolidator capabilities at the center of these exchange services. And this is just an example slide showing just the complexity of that environment and what it would look like if we were to adhere and continue to operate the way historically transactions have occurred in a point-to-point manner between the administrative side and the clinical side, or the physicians in the hospitals and health plans on one side and the health plans, PBMs, and other organizations on the other, exchanging these essentially necessary data elements or data requirements to support advancing healthcare capabilities. So as Danny was mentioning earlier about having patient-centered or consumer-centered healthcare system, that really isn't possible with what I would call a extremely complicated view like this. There has to be some places where patients and data can be routed, either coordinated, call it brokered, whatever it might be. There's this notion of, I think people are very aware of the notion of a QHIN in the TEFCA world. We'll talk about TEFCA in just a minute, a little bit more. But the idea being that these sort of central coordinating entities, if you will, which is what really NEHEN 3.0 is, with services bundled around that, we believe are going to be essential to moving us to that more advanced model of exchange capabilities and services going forward. So yeah, don't advance yet. I got one more point to make on that previous slide. So if you think about just what prior authorization is going to entail in terms of the number of transactions that we need to exchange back and forth with each other, can you imagine providers on one side and health plans on the other side, and them having to, let's call it negotiate or problem solve or troubleshoot with each other, probably on a daily basis in terms of things like connectivity, getting something through that isn't going through correctly, the technical issues associated with that, the standards compliance related activities associated with just just negotiating or brokering those transactions amongst each other, and then just dealing with trouble. You know, if there's ever an issue, and with NEHEN we deal with issues every day where there's something that's happening. You know, there's a payer that's offline because they're doing system maintenance. There's something that isn't up and running because of a technical glitch, whatever it may be. So what happens in the center is transactions are brokered in the center, so they can actually reside there until things become, you know, available again, or at least determine that there's a response coming back to either one end or the other of that transaction, and letting them know that, hey, we received your transaction, but we're unable to process it this time. You know, please come back later, kind of thing. So this model that you're looking at here, and the notion that the FHIR world should be point to point, that's the design elements of it. We've heard that mentioned a number of times, is essentially true, but the practicalities of doing that, we believe, are just going to really be a challenging thing going forward. So now we can go to the next slide. Thanks for your patience. So that's really the model that NEHEN 3.0, part of it is designed to address. It's designed to simplify that, those many-to-many, point-to-point connectivity, exchange, technical, security, standards compliance, governance, validation, content, code set mapping, you know, I think I mentioned security, I'll say it again, security, and all of those, you know, associated requirements that will be needed to really make this a robust set of services and exchange capabilities that are sustainable to advance healthcare to where I think we all believe it needs to go, with these more advanced exchanges of clinical and administrative data to support the not only prior authorization, but, you know, quality measures improvement, all sorts of other, you can imagine all the other use cases associated with pricing transparency and cost transparency and things of that nature that these services could be designed or stood up to support. So this is our model, essentially going forward, or for tomorrow as we get this NEHEN 3.0 service up and going. So next slide. So this is a very high level timeline. There's a much more detailed one that Janice presents that has a little bit more of the discrete elements that are associated with what we're doing, but just at a very, very high level, I mentioned the RFP process that we're involved in right now. So this is the timeline for that, February 23rd to this January 23rd, February 16th. We're sort of wrapping up what I would call the tail end of the written portion of the RFP review now, and we're moving into the vendor presentation mode over the next few weeks. And we're doing reference checks and getting some detailed financial data from the vendors at this point, and really kind of putting a finer point on the solutions that are available, the way vendors are thinking about them, and how they might fit into this design that we've got, you know, that we've gotten, you know, sort of at this point, to this point with, and we do have 6 finalists actually in the running now for the selection of the final vendors. We do plan to have no greater than 2 final solutions that we're expecting them to work well together and to be a part of the same NEHEN fabric, essentially, that we stand up here. But obviously, if we could find one vendor that could do it all, we'd be ecstatic. But the breadth of the services that we're describing here, from FHIR all the way to X12, to include specific use cases for prior authorization and workflows associated with that, including, as Janice mentioned, possibly standing up a CRD service and being able to, you know, do a shared community approach to coverage requirements discovery, might be beyond what, you know, one single vendor could do. So we're really, you know, kind of focusing in on those services, trying to pick the best fit there between the sort of, let's call it the core exchange capabilities with these sort of add-on capabilities. So by the end of February, sorry, I'll go back one more. By the end of February, we'll be announcing final vendors, at least the final, let's call it the vendors chosen to move into contract negotiation, initial participation agreements, and then obviously full project launch will happen sometime in March. Next slide. So what have we learned so far? We've learned a lot. I mean, it's been a fast and furious process, but certainly pretty deep in terms of the content and the types of information we've gotten back within the RFP process. There's been a lot of written exchange of information between us and the proposing vendors at this point. I think we had roughly 18, depends how you look at it. Some of the vendors consolidated multiple solution providers together to present one proposal to us, but within those there were multiple vendors, as a part of those consolidated responses. So I think there were 18 total, but we counted 12 essentially proposals, and then we've sort of whittled that down to 6 at this point that we're focusing in on. But we've learned a lot, even just in the process of where we've gone so far, that, particularly the availability of, as I mentioned a minute ago, consolidated exchange services that would include all the various use cases and capabilities that we're talking about here is limited. There's just not that many vendors that have gone that far, that have really taken it to that next level. There's some that are getting there. Certainly a lot of work going on to do that, but we're finding that we're going to have to very likely versus, there's this whole notion of doing a best of breed versus, a sort of single vendor approach. We're not going to do single vendor approach, I don't think, but we would love to see if we can get there. We've got more work to do to figure that out, but certainly getting the best of everything or best of breed needs to be balanced with the need for simple solutions. We say simple solutions, we mean, not having too many vendors to coordinate integration and, implementation and all that. So that's one thing we've learned so far, is that there's a balance point and a compromise there for sure. Many vendors are not yet using recognized standards. So I'd say that's true, but I think everybody, particularly now, the final rule for prior authorization has dropped, and it strongly recommends the use of the Da Vinci IDs and the other standards that are outlined in there. And there are standards specifically spelled out in that final rule for prior authorization. That sort of sets the course in a new direction, I think, for vendors in particular to recognize that these things are real and they're coming and they need to be adopted sooner rather than later. Even though they may not all be there yet, many are intending to move in that direction, and it's probably going to take them some time to fully get there. But we're looking for those that are aggressively going after those capabilities and adherence to recognized standards. Standards are not going away. They're going to continue to evolve and develop, and we're going to be a part of that process, and we want vendors that are going to be a part of that process with us. So there is a need for provider side regulatory requirement for prior authorization. I don't think anybody here would be surprised to hear us say that we're halfway there in terms of the final rule, if you will, regarding prior auth, because we've got the payer side now pretty well clearly spelled out. It doesn't apply to all payers, or all, I shouldn't say it doesn't apply to all plans or all payer types. It's really for the public plans at this point, essentially. But on the commercial side, we would expect most commercial payers will pick up and follow those same standards across their services and across their plans. But the provider side, we believe, is a missing piece right now, and I think others have said the same thing, that having some certification requirements on the EHR side is essential to complete the both end-to-end exchange capabilities between payers and providers around, and particularly the Da Vinci implementation guide use cases. But even just for prior authorization itself, to do the FHIR-based API exchanges that are required in the rule, we think that should be a ONC certification requirement, that EHR vendors stand up those capabilities, and it needs to happen fairly quickly because the timeline has got pushed out by a year in the final rule to 2027, but still we're in 2024 now. It's going to be a very quick turnaround before we're going to be at that point. So determining also what is real versus what is quote unquote vaporware can be difficult, and it's time consuming because you have to wade through proposals and really figure out, is this real? Is this something that's being proposed? Is it a vision on the roadmap? Where is it at this point? And we're looking for obviously real solutions today, but knowing that there is a timeline here associated with getting these services up and running and rolled out. So we're being practical about that as well too. Next slide. And then as far as the process is concerned, the other thing we've learned is you can't dive too deep initially. You kind of want to wade from the shallow end into the pool, because focusing on sort of high level capabilities, or we're calling about compatibility, but really fit within this vision that we have about NEHEN 3.0 needs to come first. And then as time goes on, we're going to dig deeper, and we're calling it peeling back more layers of the onion to figure out, does this particular solution really fit within this shared service central coordination vision that both Janice and Denny described and we've been talking about. So it does take time to go through and dig deeper and really pull back those layers with these proposed solutions. And that's kind of where we're at now. As I mentioned, we're moving right into the vendor presentation stage now over the next couple of weeks. And during those presentations, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into some specific questions and areas that we're particularly interested in with all of the vendor proposals, as well as some individually specific to the proposed solutions. So that's the next cut at this. Being adaptable and preparing to adjust, goals and expectations is important, because you go into it with a mindset and with something you believe is possible, or a set of notions you have about how things could be done or should be done, and then you learn as you go. And if you don't adapt and adjust as you're going along, you're likely to find yourself either somewhere where the community isn't, and like we said earlier, we're meeting people where they are. So you have to be adaptable to those needs. Even things like EHR integration, for example, we mentioned that before. On the EHR side, if we don't have Firebase integration on the EHR side, then how are we going to adapt to that if the EHR vendors aren't quite ready to go? And we have a risk list. We're keeping a risk list, and that's one of the things on the risk list is, what do we do if this happens, or what do we do if that happens? And so that really comes back to the third bullet point, which is having a centralized, coordinated set of activities. We have essentially a PMO office now that we're operating amongst ourselves, and we've got some work we've been doing with point of care partners and other members of our community around that to identify what are the challenges going forward, what are the potential risks, what are the remediation strategies associated with that, and how are we going to adapt and adjust as we go along. But it really broaches all aspects of what we're doing, from technology to business and operations, and then support services.
Dave, if I could just jump in and add to that point slightly.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sure.
There's another component to that as well, which is to make sure that we address technology, business, and operations cohesively, not just in the vendor process, but in the entire process of standing up, on onboarding, on interacting as a community, deciding what we do next, determining how customers actually interact with NEHEN, but basically the entire shebang. So although it is definitely important in this vendor selection process as well, it's a little bit bigger than that. And it's really part of our sort of centralized core, because the technology is really important and essential, but it's not sufficient on its own.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Janice. I totally agree. And that's the notion of this office, if you will, this program office that we've started really focusing in on the vendor's evaluation process. But that will evolve into a more, let's call it a community-oriented, service and delivery-oriented model as we move forward. So again, that's going to adapt as well into those modes as we move forward. The last bullet point, focusing on vendors who understand what you need and engage in honest discussions about it and how to implement it. I mean, obviously, that's an obvious thing, but even still, it's good to be said, because, like I said, you go in with a vision and you have a thought in your mind about how things could or should operate. And then when you begin talking to vendors, you get different perspectives, and you learn different things about their experiences and things that they bring to the table, either technologically or service wise, or even business arrangements. So, understanding, having vendors that work with you in that process is really essential, because this is uncharted territory. You know, we're kind of, you know, we're stepping into a green field here, and we have to figure out how we're going to navigate that going forward, because as far as we know, this model of service orientation and delivery across all the use cases and types of services that we're describing here, as far as we know, this isn't anywhere else. I mean, there might be other similar things. There's HIEs. We're not an HIE. I want to make sure everybody's clear on that. We're not, we haven't joined TAFCA, but we'll talk about TAFCA in a little bit. So we're not a QHIN. We don't tend to be a QHIN. So it's a different approach. And, you know, very often, you know, vendors will come in with an approach and they'll say, well, oh, you're this. And they sort of try to think about you or categorize you into something that it really isn't what you've envisioned. So having vendors who can understand that the vision of what we're describing and how we want that to work and fit within the NEHEN community is really, really important. Because otherwise, you know, we're going to find ourselves, you know, with a solution set, or even with just partners that aren't on the same page as us. So, so that's an important point. And if there's any questions, just feel free to chime in. Looks like Richard Moore might have had one, but it jumped away from me. Oh, there we go. I guess we're on to the questions Q&A session now too. So why don't we go to those questions, and then we'll just take them as they come, I suppose. And if Danny or Janice or I or anybody else wants to chime in with any response to any questions, you're certainly free to do that. Richard Moore says, are you including the departments of health and labs? So that's a great question, Richard. We are working with EOHH, our local Mass Health EOHHS office. So they've been invited to participate. Obviously, they're a part of the new prior auth requirements as a state Medicaid agency. So they are, you know, one of the required health plans that needs to provide those services. So we've been partnering with them on this very closely. The labs, not so much directly. And that's the reason for that is because, again, we're not an HIE, the traditional sense of the world where everybody's trying to share data with everybody, and it's about different use cases like syndromic surveillance or reporting of, you know, community outbreak and that kind of thing. So we're not an HIE. So I want to make sure everybody's very clear about that. This is intended to reduce burden around exchange of both administrative, and we're calling it clinical data, but it's really around API-based FHIR exchange services to reduce the friction of transactions between payers and providers that support patients, as Denny points out, patient-centered healthcare in the service and delivery of services that they need. So whether it's prior authorization, for example, getting access to those rapidly and quickly, submitting eligibility inquiries, claim submission, all the traditional administrative transactions. And then Janice will talk about quality measures too, as being a part of that, because that's a part of the exchange necessary to support clinical data associated with getting good quality data. Go ahead, Janice.
It sounds like it's my turn to chime in.
Yeah,
I heard I was invoked. Yeah, quality measures is a big part of this, but I also it's also, it goes beyond though the Mass Health, which is our Medicaid agency, the EOHHS department. We have involvement, for instance, in the Data Governance Collaborative from the Department of Mental Health, from all kinds of different agencies within that organization. The conversations that we're having are somewhat Mass Health in terms of the actual exchange, are somewhat Mass Health focused, because that's where the data actually lives and that's where patients' lives are affected. But there is still involvement from those other statewide health agencies through the EOHHS. And they're certainly very involved in the quality measures. There are Massachusetts-wide requirements for quality measures that are part of our discussion. And, you know, so there definitely is a lot of involvement from that standpoint. And I know Dave keeps saying that we're going to talk more about quality measures. So I guess I'll just give 2 minutes just so that I don't make a liar of him. We're actually looking at taking 2 separate approaches to quality measures. We have a current quality measure spec, which is predates FHIR and uses a flat file structure with secure FTP. And so one of the things that we're looking to do is have a what I like to call a common pot of data approach, which is basically a larger bulk FHIR exchange that encompasses all of the data needed to calculate the quality measures for the clients who are using it, and make sure that the people who are using our current spec, which is a large number of payers and providers within Massachusetts, that they have a pathway to FHIR and a pathway to using NEHEN, although we won't require them to use NEHEN if they wish to do it using that mechanism. And then we're also looking at the measure by measure based quality measures and data exchange for quality measures implementation guides, which are being developed in different different areas of HL7 and other communities, including Da Vinci. So we're looking at taking those two parallel approaches to quality measures. And some of the first requirements for digital quality measures come into play in measure year 2025. NCQA has started that process. So that's definitely something that's very close on our radar. We're also looking at things like US CDI Plus for quality, and what role that has to play, and whether that could be something that could be a jumping off point for that common pot of data approach. So we're still refining, as we talk about iterative process, looking at what's available, what people can do, what people need, what the regulations require. So we're still refining the specifics, but sort of at a 20,000 foot level, that's what we're looking at in terms of quality measures.
Great, thanks, Janice. I want to talk about TEFCA too in a second here, but Richard asks, is there any HL7 in the legacy? With NEHEN, there is not, Richard, and again, because we're not a traditional, if there is such a thing, a traditional HIE in terms of exchanging things like syndromic data or, the HL7, the 2.0 formats for lab results and all that. We haven't, NEHEN's never gotten into that side of the exchange world. So we're primarily an administrative data exchange today, and we're expanding that to become, sort of a more robust burden reduction model for the sort of the administrative and clinical data associated with those relationships between payers and providers that support patients' access to care and services that they need. So let's talk a little bit about TEFCA, and then we'll come back. John's got a question. Any insight, John Beasley, any insights on the business model around how users will be charged, payers versus providers versus government?
Why don't I take that, Dan?
Yeah, take that one, Danny. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe I can address that. Yeah, we're happy to share our business model. We have two stages of work, which we call pre-production and production. Pre-production is everything necessary for us to bring trading partners online, actively using the service for FHIR, X12 EDI exchange, and over time, increasingly for prior authorization and quality measures support. But the pre-production phase is really what do we need to do to get people online and using the service in compliance with the regulations. And then production is I don't want to call it a steady state, but it's the state at which we are delivering services to most of the communities and to most of the members of the community. And that during production, we may choose to add or augment the services that we provide. But we've brought, an organization, a pair of trading partners online, and they're starting to use the service. The way the funding works with that is we are working with payers to fund the pre-production phase. We're also talking with some other interested investors. We've talked briefly to the feds, briefly to the state. The beginning of longer conversations, we expect or look forward to a measure of funding support from the state and from the feds, but we don't expect it. We hope that we can secure that, but we're not relying on it. We're working more within the plans within our community to fund the pre-production process, and then payers and providers will pay API-based fees for the ongoing use of the service in production. Those fees on the investment side, those investments are scaled along a sliding scale based on the investor's organizational size relative to others. We've done this before with the Massachusetts Health Data Community. We did it when we brought ICD-9 up to ICD-10, and we conducted a collaborative testing program with over 90 organizations. And we had a collaborative funding model to make that happen. So that's how we're approaching funding. And with Rob's question, I'll briefly say, 45 years really helps to build a community. But we had a strong community when I got here going on 12 years ago. We've as has NEHEN. I think it's important to stress that both of our organizations have a long kind of interwoven history together of providing, not-for-profit based services to the health data community. Our focus is on transparency. It's a focus on not siding with one segment of the industry versus another. For example, the relations between payers and providers now are as bad as they've ever been. But our goal is to find common areas of common agreement, shared purpose. We've been working at this for a long time. But I would say one of the secrets to what we do is that we communicate and engage frequently and consistently with our community on things that are most important to them. And starting from scratch is hard, but I would say that if other communities were thinking about setting up an organization like ours, we'd be happy to provide whatever we've learned. It's not all something that requires decades of practice. Some of this is beginning to secure this level of commitment from customers. Many payers and providers will look in marketplaces and say, this is a service we can need, that we need and we can use. So if we can get those communities together to act collaboratively rather than have regulations foisted on them, then that's a great step going forward.
And if I could just
Dave, I'll
elaborate,
turn it back to you. Go ahead,
if
Janet.
I could just elaborate slightly, just to push one of Denny's points, we regularly meet with and talk to all different facets of our community. The data governance collaborative that I run meets weekly. We have a monthly NEHEN business users meeting, but we're also talking to people one-on-one all the time. We're talking to groups. We're responsive if people email us to talk about something. We take their suggestions on areas that we need to pay attention to. No Surprises wasn't on our radar until one of our members said, hey, have you seen this thing? What's up with this? And you guys should pay attention to it. And that was how we started looking at the No Surprises Act, which is one of the things that we look at quite a bit in the Data Governance Collaborative. So it really is this idea of we are a collaborative community and that we're responsive and that we will look at, be iterative, be agile, and be responsive and also transparent.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I'll just mention too that NEHEN has always provided value. Honestly, we've always been a good value for our members to join and get with the services that they need. So I think there's that expectation we're going to continue to deliver that value. Richard Moore asks, is there any federal funding involved? No, Richard, there isn't. Denny just described that funding model fairly well. I wanted to address, Ashish has a question about, I think you briefly touched on a single vendor versus multi-vendor approach for NEHEN 3.0. Can you please elaborate on it from a preference and mechanism perspective? So I'll take a stab at it, and then if Danny or Janice have any comments, please chime in. Like I said before, it's a balance between complexity and simplicity. I'd say complexity and simplicity. Obviously, it's a balance between single vendor solution that we might have to compromise on functionality versus sort of the best of breed notion where you would go out and choose the best solution you could find in each of the various category areas. So what we've done is we've categorized our evaluation into sort of buckets, X12, core fire, EPA, quality measures, technology, infrastructure, et cetera. So in our evaluation, we've kind of compartmentalized how we're looking at the solution, different solution options that are being proposed. And what we're going to do then is kind of meld those together and come up with the best fit that gets us to where we need to go overall, but doesn't overly compromise our best solutions. At the same time, doesn't create an overly complex environment for us. And Denny, you've got your hand raised up. So go ahead, Denny.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Ashish, this is a very good question, and the answer to it is kind of across a number of different aspects if you look at it. One is we're in an evolutionary period of going from largely brokered EDI exchange through clearinghouse for payer-provider connectivity to a world in the future where there'll be increasing direct connectivity between payers and providers. We're not there. We're not at the latter yet. And the former is not enough to either meet regulations, deliver value, write better contracts. So we need to sit in the middle when it comes to, do we go with, a single vendor or not? The reality is we're in a place where the vendors are not yet up to speed across the portfolio that we have. So we need to look at multiple vendors. The other thing is that we have, the market for X12 services and the market for fire services is very divided now. The former is occupied by, long established organizations with, doing this work for a long, long time on the EDI side. Fire is essentially, dominated by, smaller, newer organizations with the engineering chops to do API integration and standing up fire facades. So we're looking at two different customer bases and trying to find, who has the most of what we need, who has the best of what we need. And the last thing that Dave has alluded to that I would mention is, we're unlikely to find a single vendor. We think that's probably the case, but we need to reduce the number of vendors we work with to be manageable from a PMO perspective, from a project management organization perspective. So, being first often leaves you with, fewer choices or fewer simpler choices, which is where we are. We're happy to face that challenge, but it's a reality. And also, you need to manage costs and we need to provide value to our users. So, finding the best combination or the best vendor or vendors has to also be balanced by, the relative cost. The more a vendor does for you, the more expensive it is. So, at what point do we as an organization with NEHEN as a service start supporting more of what third-party solutions providers do? And where do we need the third-party solutions providers to take it up? So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I was on mute. Sorry. Yeah, that was a good response. Thanks, Denny. So I know we have a few minutes left, about 8 minutes. I don't see any more active questions coming in. So we just wanted to mention TEFCA. That's all we're going to really do is just mention it and just let folks know that we've had some conversations with the folks at Sequoia and ONC and CMS about it. And we're just sort of evaluating at this point, how TEFCA might intersect with the work we're doing with NEHEN 3.0. We're not sure yet, honestly, so we're open to any comments or feedback or thoughts others may have about it. I did mention we don't have any intentions on being a QHIN, so that's for sure. But what we are looking at in particular are the TEFCA version 2.0 of the TEFCA agreement now, which includes the use of FHIR-based transactions and services within that model. So it's possible that NEHEN might become a node somewhere on the TEFCA Exchange Service Network. We're not sure yet, but if it certainly benefits our members, and it's kind of what Janice was describing earlier about, we're gonna go where our the need is. We're gonna move to where people direct us from our internal collaborations and governance processes dictate, and it will be toward those things that make the most sense for the overall NEHEN community to adopt. And if it happens to be, joining TEFCA as a node on one of the exchange QHIN networks or something like that, then that's possibly what we'll do, but it's too early to tell at this point. Denny, got your hand up?
Yeah, just to add briefly to what you're saying, Dave, when we look at the health plan marketplace, we're obviously looking at fewer players than there are providers. I mean, when we look at physician practices, medical groups, community hospitals with either, physicians with privileges or physicians who are employed to large teaching and academic centers, there are tens of thousands of providers out there. When we look at the health plan, it's orders of magnitude less or fewer. And I think when we look at TEFCA, the questions that we have about TEFCA and what we see happening in the marketplace is that even though health providers will be, in all likelihood, required to offer, provide a fire facade, either to their electronic medical record or to a secondary store of needed information. Their electronic medical records are not very well aligned. There's a lot of, heterogeneity. There's a nice way of putting it. A lot of data that are not where APIs will be pointed to, that are in text fields and notes. So, we look at TEFCA possibly as an organizing influence for providers, because the provider marketplace has, they don't have to invest as much in the technology as they do in sort of the digital hygiene, the discipline to make the electronic record as robust a data source as it can possibly be. And with TEFCA, not only for their organizations, but for others who may need the data. So as Dave says, we're going to be talking more with the folks at Sequoia, with the QHINs, a couple of QHINs, to learn more about how we would coexist in a world. Because we're not an HIE and our focus is on data-related services, we think there's a complement. We just haven't figured out exactly how that works.
And I'll go ahead and add one more thing just for folks who may have missed it. Dave mentioned the Common Agreement version 2. Sequoia very quietly released 15 documents for comment on Friday afternoon, including the Common Agreement version 2 and a quality measure standard operating procedure. So part of this process will also be looking at the specifics of what they're supporting in this next version going forward. But anyone who's interested in TEFCA should go over to Sequoia and take a look at the newly released draft documents. And if you'd like to comment, you have about 2 weeks to do that.
Great. I don't see any more questions, but if there are any more, now would be a good time. If not, we can give some time back. Michael, are we good? I don't know if Michael's still on.
You guys are looking good. Special thanks to the folks
Excellent.
at Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, David, Denny, Janice, and Katie behind the scenes. Oh, it looks like there might be a question. I'm not sure. Let's see. Oh, Leslie saying thank you. So guys, thank you very much. And for everyone who's still on, the recording and the slides will be sent to all registrants post-event. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.